However, the like you said, the Vedas is describing intelligent species, human-like species throughout the universe, and that's an immediate challenge to evolution, as you mentioned there, because how is it that this this anthropod, one head, two arms, two legs, our form basically, can be replicated in other worlds by accident on another planet as well? I mean, it doesn't make any sense unless you bring in interplanetary travel. And as soon as you bring in interplanetary travel, then you've got to bring in the fact that our origins could be from other planets. All right, I'll kind of go way back, but I won't go into too much detail. I remember as a child always believing in reincarnation. I always felt that I was part of something bigger, and that this was, even as a practically as a toddler walking around, learning new things about my environment. It was probably my back garden somewhere in the UK. And although everything was new, as it is for all of us that age, there was sense that I'd been here before. So therefore, by the time I was a teenager, I was automatically open, I suppose you could say, to the Indic religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, because of course they more readily accept reincarnation as part of their infrastructure. However, I mean, I remember when I was, 12, 13, being interested in meditation, because the realizations I was getting was that the world around us had lacked reality, or it was dreamlike in some way. But I didn't have any understanding or realizations beyond that at the time. So therefore, by the time you learn a little bit about science, and I've recounted this before in, I think, some of my videos, when you learn about, say, the Big Bang, or evolution and these kind of things, it tends to overshadow your upbringing about going to church as a child, or singing hymns at school, or even in the school choir. And you think, okay, religion is fine, but this science seems to make a lot more sense, because it's given us medical care, it's given us space rockets, it's given us the internet for that matter. And what does religion do, you see? So that was the kind of we're talking about the mid-80s here, giving my age away, by this time. So I wasn't say I was an atheist, but I was a frustrated theist, or for that matter, a frustrated atheist. I was quite literally somewhere in between. But having that belief in reincarnation got me through into Buddhism. But of course, Buddhism doesn't necessarily give you much information about God by definition. It's somewhere in between, but it was a good place to start. But when I started reading the books about Hinduism, initially it was difficult to understand, because you've got pictures of all the demigods and Lord Ganesh and Lord Shiva and some of these other things, the caste system, and things which you could argue are not necessarily going to attract someone, I don't think. However, when I think I came across, of course, the books of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, of ISKCON books, it all kind of gradually and quite quickly actually knitted together, because there was everything explained in a way that made sense to me. So you got the best of both worlds. Perhaps as a Western person, his purports were understandable, let's say, to people outside of Indian origin. And the scientific aspect, which of course I was interested in, appeared to be addressed as well. And the Bhagavatam in particular, Srimad Bhagavatam, was quite clearly the voice of not just an old ancient intelligence, but an ancient civilization. I kind of sense it was part of something bigger. So as you can imagine, one thing led to another. I was studying drama at the time at Manchester University in the north of England. But I started, I remember I became a vegetarian for secular reasons. But I started going to the Hare Krishna temple in that city. And I guess you could say one thing led to another. I ended up at Bhaktivedanta Manor. But parallel to that, as I kind of hinted, and as I mentioned again in one of my presentations, when I was going through that kind of that theist stroke atheist kind of pathway, somewhere in between these worlds, I was quite fascinated by the works of Erich von Däniken, who wrote, of course, Chariots of the Gods, Gold of the Gods, and Return to the Gods, or Return of the Gods. There's a whole series of books actually. There's several books, 4 or 5 actually, and all saying, for those who are not so familiar with this world, that a lot of religion, whether it's Hinduism or Christianity or anything, actually, even Somalian texts, all these ancient texts were, and even indeed mankind's origin and in his own culture was basically coming from being some other worlds. So even references to angels and demons were actually retranslated, if you like, to good aliens and bad aliens, or something like that. Or the subtitle to his first book was God an Astronaut, meaning he didn't accept evolution, actually. And his proposal was that perhaps early ape man, or even very early forms of Neanderthal, or whatever, or Homo, what's it called? I think it's called now, Australopithecus, or some earlier form of man in the evolutionary theory, was brought up to the Homo sapien level as we recognise today by external forces, beings from other worlds, other dimensions, other planets. So for me, that information I carried with me into ISKCON, into the Hare Krishna movement. So I, obviously, so I still had lots of questions after reading Prabhupada's books. So therefore, that led me to reading more, I suppose you could say, scientific-minded or academic books, actually, published by the Bhaktivedanta Institute, which, of course, incidentally, was founded by Prabhupada in the early 70s. But one of the founder charter members was Richard Thompson, or Sadhaputta Prabhu. So consequently, I got into Sadhaputa's books. Of course, you got to realise this is all kind of going on in the background. Meanwhile, I was at Bhaktivedanta Manor. I was feeding cows. I was on the Bhakta course there. I was washing pots, learning Bhagavad Gita verses, doing reception, communications, public relations work, preaching, morning, etc. This usual temple devotee lifestyle as the main thrust. But there I was, not just only reading Prabhupada's books, but of course books such as, in fact, I've got a few here if I can show you. Something
Yes.
I prepared earlier. Is that okay? Can I do that?
Of
I don't know
course.
what the quality. Okay, so let's see if you can see that or not. If the
Vedic
lighting,
and
Vedic Cosmography and Astronomy by
Yeah,
Richard
I think
Thompson.
you mentioned this in one of your videos.
Yeah. So this was one of my first books on cosmology, or Vedic cosmology, that I started reading. And there's another book as well of Sadhaputta which I read, which I suppose you could say was the follower. I suppose I don't know the word, the sequel, let's say, and that's this one, Sacred Universe, Mysteries of the Sacred Universe. Again, this was kind of addressing, just like the first book, addressing Vedic cosmology as described mainly in the Srimad Bhagavatam and the fifth canto, but I'm connecting it, let's say, to modern astronomy. So not kind of describing all these things, some of these things which we find far out, that we read it, I mean, I could go into the details of it if you wish, but just for now, just to say some of the most far out, most amazing descriptions in the Bhagavatam, but on their own, without a kind of description, they sound like it's mythological, frankly, or it's a story. However, when you familiarise yourselves with some of these additional books, you think actually there's a great science behind here. And this again is even Harry Van Daniken used to say that, oh well, a flying chariot in the book of Ezekiel in the Bible was actually describing a UFO or a Vimana, a flying craft or something. So when you marry these two together, modern empirical conspiracy theory, if you like, or science, or series on the television about alien identities, and you marry this with the Bhagavatam, you've actually got a really, really fascinating picture. And then slowly but surely, other aspects start to make sense or click together. Like, for example, things that we accept they're in the scriptures, but things which are very, very far out, frankly, but we just accept them, but we don't question them, or sometimes devotees don't question them too much. But they're niggling at the back of our minds. But how can someone live for hundreds of thousands of years, for example, And yet, when we enshroud ourselves, when we educate ourselves with this scientific dimension based on our own conditioning, but it's necessary for us to understand, it all clicks together. For example, the Yuga cycle, a 4.32 million year Yuga cycle, Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, Kali
Yeah.
Yuga, in extraordinary lengths of time, each lasting hundreds of thousands of years. And the thing is that the lengths of time that humanoids or demigods used to live in the past is barely imaginable to us, and it doesn't actually make any medical scientific sense for someone to live 100,000 years on the earth until you begin to unpack it and you realize that's on the earth, but we're not talking about the earth. The actual Bhagavatam is describing the highlights, the devotional or the relevant highlights of this universe for this Kalpa, for this day of Lord Brahma so far. And it's not just limited to the earth. The Yuga cycles is not just the earth, but actually it's representing humanoid beings from across the universe.
Okay.
So when you really throw the doors open there and you go beyond the town that we're in, beyond the country that we're in, beyond the planet we're in, you think, actually, this is really fascinating stuff. So I wanted to share this, and I felt that giving the occasional Bhagavatam class and trying to fit that, all that stuff I've been talking about, into the average verse that you get to talk on wasn't enough. And I started to think about how I could explain this. And eventually, I suppose, when it was possible to become a YouTuber, of course, that wasn't really possible in the 1990s so much. I was born 1970, so obviously the 70s and the 80s you can wipe on when it comes to the internet. And then the internet came in about 94, I think it was, something like that. But still, to become a kind of a fluent YouTuber, to make YouTube videos about it, but feel that you've got enough subscribers and followers around the world, that's kind of something only relatively recently. So when that became a worthwhile project, I started to do just that. Hence my YouTube channel. So that's my story, and that's how it all links together.
Gotten together, an overall picture of what you talked about in all your videos. So starting off, because you mentioned evolution, how you said that in the Vedic perspective, we see the universe as being, hugely populated. It's not just us. There is 400,000 humanoid species, I think it mentions.
Yeah, 400,000 different humanoid species, that's correct. Yeah.
Across the universe. So, yeah, so I think you've mentioned in one of your videos, and I also agree that this doesn't fit in with the idea that life came from chemicals or from matter. If that was the case, obviously that is only earth-based. So how would we explain this otherwise? Like, in what would you define as alien? Because right now, when a normal person would think of an alien, they think of big head, big eyes, skinny body. But what would you define as aliens to start off with?
Okay, really, really good question. Again, this 400,000 human species thing that we find in the Vedas and the Puranas is something which it was a bridge I needed to cross to try to understand that, because are we talking about 400,000 different human species that we see today? I mean, do you know 400,000 different human species? And I don't. I know about 10 or 20 maybe that's on the earth, even if you include Bigfoot or Sasquatch or all the different tribes. Still, 400,000 seems to be very large. And again, you get into alien identities and you link it with mythology, for example, and you begin to realize actually Prabhupada is purporting about other planets as well. Now, the definition of alien. First of all, what do I count as alien and what is not alien? The definition of alien is extraterrestrial, which would mean, I guess you could say, would refer to any intelligent, or actually even not non-intelligent, any living being that is outside of the Earth's atmosphere. So therefore, if they found some worm, for example, in the mud on Mars, that would count as alien, would it not? However, the like you said, the Vedas is describing intelligent species, human-like species, throughout the universe, and that's an immediate challenge to evolution, as you mentioned there, because how is it that this this anthropod, one head, two arms, two legs, our form basically, can be replicated in other worlds by accident on another planet as well? I mean, it doesn't make any sense unless you bring in interplanetary travel. And as soon as you bring in interplanetary travel, then you've got to bring in the fact that our origins could be from other planets, and thus challenging theory of evolution. On every level, theory of evolution is surrounded here, and it's cornered, actually. Um, and there are other arguments, of course, against the theory of evolution, and I'm not saying it's completely incorrect in every respect, because we do say that, if, for example, we're a lot taller than we were 500 years ago on average around the world. So, but that's not change of species, that's change of characteristics within a species. But there is change. So, yes, what most people think of aliens as being like ET or Greys, something which is not very much like us, and yet, even within popular stories that you hear about abductions and all these things, I'm not saying every single story is true, but relating to those stories, not only are the googly-eyed aliens, or whatever that are prominent features, but actually what they call the Nordics as well feature in these stories, or humanoid forms which are a lot more similar to ourselves. Again, a slap in the face to evolution. So really, different people in different cultures have different definitions of alien. Of course, what we actually mean is something which is not one of the terrestrial-based, Earth-based species that we are familiar with. Now, out there in the Vedic universe, you've with 400,000 different species to ponder over, that would include the what I would regard as perhaps the demoniac type, the grey type, but it will also include the Nordic type, and it will also, that figure would also include the divine and the demoniac as well, or as well as rakshasas or vampires and all these things. So the idea is that all these things sound mythological, and many stories probably are. But however, is it not based on some ancient knowledge, some ancient intelligence that has passed itself down through scripture, through word of mouth, and through tradition, that is telling us that actually it's not our origins as a species, or whichever species we're talking about, is not basically quite as simple as what evolution would suggest. I hope that answers.
Because what we learned from the beginning, and I think this exists in all the religions. So trying to link up the really religic principles that we know about with the Vedic science, trying to understand how that comes together. When it's told that God made the human form as a mirror of himself, how can we put that in the picture you just described? Because if we are talking about demoniac forms or divine forms will have specific elements that we as normal human beings are not knowing about on this planet, how does that come together?
Okay, first of all, your reference to, I think you're probably referring to a verse that would be familiar to me in the book of Genesis, where it describes that God made man in his own image. I think that's what we're describing, and I'm sure that exists in other Abrahamic traditions as well as other traditions. And this again fits in with the Vedic tradition, but the Vedic tradition has a lot more detail. What that is saying is that it's suggesting that God, at least in some of his forms, also has this humanoid image. But it's not that we have created God to be like us in our minds. Oh, we feel more comfortable with God looking similar to us, only better, and only like a supreme version of us. But it's not that we've imagined it, but rather that God, obviously by definition, existed before us, as did the demigods and other forms, and that we have simply been based on their image. So we're the carbon copies. Now, in terms of God's beauty, Krishna's beauty in particular, or Vishnu's beauty, or whoever's beauty, or demigod's beauty, they are superior to us, and we would therefore, by definition, find them attractive. Now, if there are, for example, let's say alien species, humanoid species, which are not attractive to us, then we could perhaps, it may be an argument to suggest that they are not, they are lower than us spiritually in the universe, perhaps asuras of some type. Because, as we know, quite fundamental to Krishna consciousness is the understanding that Krishna is all attractive. Krishna is very beautiful. In fact, he is attractive to everybody, even attractive to animals and trees, and even demons find him attractive. So this is the definition of God. Whatever we have, whatever bodily features we have, are simply inferior versions of what he has. But we are actually, you could say, made in his image in that sense.
Yes.
You mentioned how we have, aliens is just any species that is extraterrestrial or beyond this earth. But I've heard you mention in, I think it was one of your interviews, with the School of Bhakti, and you said how there's aliens on the surface of the earth beyond our perception. So has that got to do with different dimensions, or what is that? Because that is completely beyond me. Under the earth's surface, outside the earth, I can understand, but on the earth's surface, how is that possible?
All right. Okay. So I think, first of all, if you look at some of the stories in the Puranas, or even Mahabharata, but you hear about yakshas, for example. That if you hear the story in the Mahabharata about Bhima, and he goes off and he goes to find, I think it's 1,000-petaled lotus flower for Draupadi. He enters into the Himalayan mountains and he goes through a pathway, and he actually meets Hanuman. And Hanuman, I think, tests him and chats to him after a while. But he goes through, he's allowed to pass Lord Hanuman. And he enters into Alakapuri, actually, which is the abode of Kubera, who has very, very beautiful gardens. Very, very beautiful gardens and lakes, and there's populated by yakshas, which we would regard, I suppose, as being non-human, although they were human-like. And the question is that we can't see them. During Bhima's journey, by the Himalayas, he was able to access other realms, and we see that quite similar with Ram and Lakshman in the Ramayana, where they're able to go and they meet Hanuman, or they go to meet Sugriva, and they go and see the monkey. They go and meet the monkeys, for example, and there's Bali, and there's all these different kind of creatures. I think they're called Varanas, I believe. Yeah, Kimpurusha. So, but we can't see them. If we go to there today, and we go and take a photograph, what we'll see are basically beautiful mountains and lakes, and we might end up in Tibet somewhere. However, the understanding is in the Vedas, as far as we can deduce, is that there are portals or pathways, something that, again, which only the qualified people are able, especially in former yugas, or qualified people who are able to enter realms via the Himalayas. And to support this, not only these stories, but also the 5th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam describes the island of Jambudvi. The mountains of Jambudvi are absolutely huge by our understanding, where they're like thousands and thousands of miles high, much higher than the Himalayas. But anyway, within and around these mountains of Jambudvi, we've got these sophisticated spiritual populations that would include, of course, Kimpurusha Dweep and Kubera's abode and Lord Shiva's abode. But these mountain ranges match a lot of the mountain ranges of South Central Asia topography. You know, there's similarities there, and yet we would go, but we do not experience these other realms described in the Bhagavatam. We do not experience rivers of mango juice, for example, in the Pamir Mountains, or Kashmir. We do not experience such beauty as described in the fifth canto. So what's going on here? And the explanation, of course, is, and the same similar principle applies to realms underneath the earth, where you've got these different subterranean realms. Again, we do not experience it, and the only plausible explanation is that there are gateways or portals or accessibility rights or whatever, from which the qualified, like Arjuna, like Bhima, for example, are able to converse with superior beings like demigods and Lord Shiva. A good example, for example, Mount Kailash is associated with Lord Shiva, as many people know. But there's different ways of looking at that mountain. One is to say, well, it's just a geographical mountain, and people could see it from a material point of view. So it's got this amount of granite, this amount of meters high, this is the amount of snow cover, and okay. But that's from our mundane KaliYuga 5 senses. But a lot of the Vedas is describing the world as perceived by more than our 5 senses. And a lot of the characters that exist in Mahabharata, Ramayana, Srimad Bhagavatam these personalities I think are obviously quite clearly able to access and see things that we cannot. There's a very good example where Srila Prabhupada himself was actually on a plane. He was flying over the Alps, specifically over Switzerland.
I was going to ask you about this next.
Yeah, and he looked out the window and he said, "Oh, I can see Meru or whatever." And his disciples, unsurprisingly perhaps, could not. And the idea is, of course, that the qualified people are able to see spiritual things that we cannot. Simple as that. So in former yugas, where the average human being had more powers and more spiritual credits, or more karma, they could access these realms and see these realms as if they were just next door. Just as much as Amsterdam exists or London exists or Paris exists, these are places which we don't question. But to the qualified, they could access these realms just as easy as we could access a city in our dimension.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So is Mount Meru still on the earth? It's still on the earth. We just can't see it, or it's not here in KaliYuga.
Very good point. That's a very good question. And in fact, I've thought about this often myself, because there's a school of thought which is that is it a description of the earth as it is now, but we simply can't see it, like you suggested? Or is it a description of the earth as it was in former yugas and now it's gone away? And the answer is both. Because you might say, what does that mean? It quite simply means this: as the yugas go by, we're able to perceive less and less, and therefore, as far as we're concerned, we're living on this globe about 8,000 miles across, and that's what it is. Now, if we can't access other parts of the universe in this KaliYuga, then in a sense, you could say that it's not here. In a way, you could say it's gone, but actually, it's only gone from our perception. It's only gone from our sight. And the best example is, of course, the demigods themselves. It's not that we say, "Oh, Lord Shiva only exists in the Satya Yuga or Treta Yuga." No, we don't. We don't say that. It's just that we may be less qualified to interact with these personalities as before. I think that's my understanding. However, there is a fascinating aspect as well when it comes to Puranic history, because a lot of the things in the Puranas are written in the past tense. A lot of the stories, or Maharaj Priyavata did this, or Lord Shiva did that. So it does suggest long, long ago. And if you do your maths, if you count the Yuga cycles, the Manvantaras, the period of Swayambhuva Manu, Chakshutra Manu, and you actually really kind of get your calculator out. It is actually talking about things that happened millions of years ago. Like Maharaj Priyavata and these flying chariot, for example, took place in the Uttama Manvantara, and you work it out, it was about 1 billion years ago. So yeah, there's some of that is past tense, but it's not that all the demigods, for example, all the personalities that could do these type of things, or access these type of realms, are suddenly all disappeared because we're now a few thousand years into KaliYuga. It seems to me it's simply that they're all still going on, but the demigods are simply not bothered with us anymore. It was only 5,000 years ago. So, excuse me, I'll finish. It was only 5,000 years ago, during the period of the Mahabharata, where Bhishma Dev, who himself, all the Pandavas actually, were sons of their fathers, Lord Indra, for example, or Vayu, the wind god, or the sun god. The half human, half demigod, actually, they were. That's where they got their powers from. And that was relatively recent in history. And I'm not led to believe that just because now we're in the Kali Yuga and humankind fell down spiritually since then, that suddenly Jamboree just vanishes. It simply vanishes from our sight due to our lack of qualification.
Right. I was actually thinking, and it reminds me of the same concept, which people are not even already ready to believe. For example, the Ram Setu. There are proofs or elements that you can say that there was something built in that area and it still exists. You can see it. However, due to the unqualification, as you call it, of people like us, or people who are not that conscious about the Vedic knowledge, that they are not ready to believe that something like that could happen. So that when you asked the question about the Meru mountain, it reminded me of Ram Setu. I think it's a similar concept, that because Ram Setu was built in Treta Yuga, which is already also quite a few years ago, but we see existing elements on the earth.
Yes, I mean, the idea is, if we look at, for example, there are things which are first of all, there's what we call a knowledge filter. That's the first thing. And what I mean by that is, if you get, for example, the pyramids, or for something which was actually quite sophisticated today, or if you get ancient temples, you could see that, or even Machu Picchu, I believe in South America, in I think it was Chile. Or then you've got the Nazca lines, or you've got these things, or Easter Island. You've got these things around the world which are evidence of past advanced civilizations. However, that it's still relatively recent. However, there is a lack of knowledge of them, and what tends to happen through this knowledge filter I described is that the archaeologists will generally tend to kind of make them as recently as possible in order to accommodate the theory of evolution or something, or things which simply do not fit into contemporary theories will even be shelved or ignored. And there is that bias there. There is a bias that does exist in mainstream archaeology, where if there's something which is so outlandish that doesn't fit into mainstream theories, then they will shift the theory a little bit here in a few inches. Oh, maybe modern humans have been around for a little bit longer than we thought, but they're never actually going to fully embrace, or very easily, they're not going to very easily embrace this concept that we're coming up with, which is a multi-dimensional universe with humanoids going back billions of years. I mean, it's far out. So the tendency is to try to reject that and really only believe what our senses tell us. And even within our senses, there are things which people tend to ignore, and people see what they want to see.
Yes.
That's the point. We're doing that all the time. We believe what we want to believe. And this is something which I think again is more prominent in the KaliYuga than in ever before. People settle on something, and no matter what you show them, they'll still believe that, unless the odds and the evidence is absolutely overwhelming. For example, someone would say, "I don't believe in XYZ because I can't see it in my front room," or "I don't believe in this because the newspaper hasn't told me that yet." And this is actually not the process that you follow in order to gain knowledge, according to the Vedas.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, in one of your videos, how we now usually, or modern science as of now, follows a bottom-up process, whereas in Vedic times or in the Vedic philosophy, we take the top-down process where we take the knowledge we have from our ancestors in our scriptures and use that to understand the universe. Because for us, we're so tiny, we can't understand this whole universe just by our little brains. So yeah, that was really interesting. My next question to you was, you've said in some of your videos how subterranean regions below the earth correlated with the inner core of the earth as we know it now. So the Vedic subterranean regions correlate with the inner core of the earth as we know it now. And also one of the realms below us is called Rasatala, and it translates to, in Sanskrit, underground realm. So do you think hollow earth is a possibility?
Good question. Very good question. Very interesting question. Yeah, just to kind of just to pick up on what you were talking about, just for those who are perhaps listening to this for the first time. So the Bhagavatam describes a series of subterranean realms that's called Bilgeswag, Atala, Vitala, Talatala, Rasatala, as mentioned, Patala, and Mahatala. Rasatala, yes, it basically means an abyss, a dark place, and is described as being. Now here's the thing. On the one hand, it describes these things being underneath Jampuri, where you've got these, but at the same time, the figures given in the Bhagavatam in yojans at 8.5 miles per yojan means that it's too far down to actually fit into the earth, because you're talking about thousands of miles in between each realm, and the earth is only supposed to be about 7,900 and something miles across. So the clue here is that it would appear to combine the two, and this is something that Sadhaputta Prabhu does suggest, some type of combination between going down underneath the earth and entering one of these portals, or some type of high dimensional vision, where the idea, I think, is that with the subterranean realms are concerned, is that yes, you would initially, the gateways to them would be by going down in caverns or underground, but it's not that they're necessarily physically there in the way that we understand. A lot, like we were saying earlier, a lot of these human-like forms, let's say call them humanoid or human-like forms, amongst the 400,000 species, are different from us in some ways. The different combination of their bodies are made of a different combination of the gross and subtle elements. Let me explain that briefly, but also answer your question. So that we know, for example, our bodies are made of a combination of earth, water, fire, air, and ether. We have a lot of water, for example. We have earth meaning the flesh, the stuff we can touch, the solids. Air as well, of course, and ether. But there are some humanoid species which have a completely different combination. They also, their bodies, their actual visible bodies, the bodies they inhabit, are actually made of mind, intelligence, and false ego. That's called the subtle body. Just like we have an astral body, or you hear about ghosts, for example, where ghosts would have a different combination, would have some, wouldn't be made of matter that we can perceive, but they have this maybe mind. Mind, often a depressed, confused mind, is keeping their subtle bodies in that ghost body, is the Bhuta. So the point is that there are indeed realms underneath the earth, but they're not necessarily made of the same matter, the different combinations that are within our senses.
So
Does that make sense? So in terms of the physical hollow earth, the idea of, in a physical sense, you go down into the earth, you'll see that it's got its own sun and all those things. I don't adhere to. I think in a physical sense, the earth is probably quite similar to what the geologists would tell you. There's the lava, and then there's the earth's magnetic core, and all these things are there. But from the point of view of a demigod, or indeed a demon, or whatever, some other human form, they're able to go down into the earth and then access these different worlds.
because of the way their bodies are made, I'm assuming.
Yeah, they have a different. There's an example where I think it was Arjuna who gets dragged into this lake, and he goes into the lake, and then I think he goes to the world of Varuna, or similar. And again, if you go and we excavate that lake, we probably won't just find fish and things like that. We're not going to find Varuna there. But again, he was able to, or especially in former yugas, they were able to somehow transfer into more subtle realms in these bodies and then transfer back. And that is something that we just simply can't do today, for most part. Of course, some people would say that they might even try and correct me. In fact, they have corrected me sometimes on some of my live broadcasts, and say, well, I know the story of somebody who had this experience, and they saw somebody in their room, and it was this and that and the other, or somebody who's had miraculous experiences. And I'm not saying that these things are not possible in the KaliYuga. I'm just saying that they are, one, rarer than they were, two, less auspicious than they were, meaning we are more likely to have interaction with ghosts or inauspicious entities because of the nature of our own consciousness and the consciousness of the world we live in.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
More, I think all your answers are referring or kind of enforcing me to think that the earth or the matter or the surroundings around us are much more than we are perceiving through our human eyes. We have to have that higher consciousness and spiritual eyes to probably experience these great things that you've all talked about.
I would say so, very much. I would say that's exactly correct. Yeah.
And the influences we have, whether that's our friends or society or what we see on TV, we are put in tunnel vision where Earth is like this, trees should be like this, humans should be like this, and we are not able to think outside the box that there exists another world around us, even without knowing us.
Yeah, I mean, you could even say a good example of that would be even within our own world, as it were, the world that we're able to perceive. There are different people who are on different levels of consciousness, obviously. For example, some people would listen to 5 minutes of what we're talking about and switch us off and then go and watch something that's a bit more mainstream. And some people can handle it, let's say, and other people are really interested and will get completely drawn into it. And if it's not your cup of tea, it's an English expression, meaning if it's not your thing, then you're simply blind to it in a sense. And people, for example, the television or YouTube channel, people will tend to subscribe to things they're interested in, and then see more and more of that.
Of course.
The good thing I think about modern times and the internet is that if you're interested in these type of subjects, there's actually plenty of places to find it these days. Because you imagine centuries ago, say medieval times in Europe, where you had basically one state religion, and if you didn't follow it, you were probably burnt as a witch or something like that in Europe. So things are actually not so bad. Since the advent of Lord Caitanya Mahaprabhu, there's a spiritual renaissance in India, but actually, in one sense, there was a kind of a material renaissance at the time in Europe. But ultimately, it had led to the fact that we are, there's relative civilization from which we're able to access spiritual knowledge if we want it. And that's part of the definition of the golden age of Lord Caitanya, where at least in the beginning stages of that golden age, it doesn't mean that everybody's kind of like pure devotee suddenly overnight, but rather it just means that the doorway is open to this spiritual knowledge that sincere people are able to access.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's touch on multiverses. All right. So, the first thing is this. This is the confusing bit, right? On the one hand, in the Vedas, of course, you have Mahavishnu that is breathing in and out from the pores of his skin, and each pore is delivering
Yes.
this universe. And as he breathes in, he sucks all those universes back into his pores. As he breathes out, these universes are being born again, and each one is a lifetime of the universe. And there's many of them. There's millions of them. Actually, billion. And so someone could say, well, okay, that's a multiverse. And yet you look to people who are believers in quantum mechanics, for example, quantum theory, who have, out of quantum theory, they would also talk about the multiverse. The reality is, however, is that the quantum multiverse is a very different concept to that of although it's similar to the multiverse of Mahavishnu, it's actually based on something very, very different. The quantum verse is very, very atheistic, because it's basically taking away, it's saying every time there's a different possibility, there's a new universe that is created, ultimately. And there's a lot of, now there's even, I suppose you could describe it as being neo-quantum verse theories, where how can there be that many universes if every time there's a different possibility or someone makes a different choice, there's almost like a new universe. All that kind of does make sense if you are interested in connecting particle physics to quantum mechanics and you don't believe in the soul or individual soul of an entity. But even people interested in the quantum multiverse ultimately think, well, perhaps all these different possibilities are there, but somehow it still ends up as one universe. So it's really kind of confusing. Now, here's the question: how does that compare yet with the ancient concept of the multi-universe of Mahavishnu? And I think it's something quite different, because the difference is it's coming from God, it's coming from Lord Vishnu. And in each universe is a Brahmandam, and the head of each universe is a different Lord Brahma. That stuff we know. But it's a very different concept to the quantum multiverse, I have to say. Is it? If you just look at, for example, if you look at count the layers, I think it's in Canto 3, it describes the size of the different elemental layers that cover this Brahmandala, or this 4 billion mile solar system, as you might say. You add the layer of earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, false ego, and you times each layer by 10. You actually get something which is, and also a quote from the Srila Siddhanta, something of the circumference of the each unit, and and therefore in the Vedas what they call the Mahaprabhu. There's only one Mahaprabhu. There's only one cosmic manifestation at any one time. But the quantum multiverse is actually wrong, because it means there's too many universes. It means every time one atom goes left instead of right throughout the whole of history, each time you're manifesting millions of universes every millisecond. And you've got to take that back to the beginning of the universe. So there's another universe where I didn't say that, I said something else. And there's another universe where I touch the top of my head and my nose, and there's another universe where I don't do that. I mean, it's just too much.
Yeah.
It's just too much. So So anyway, that's my answer.
Yeah, but within the Mahavishnu universes that are born out of the skin or out of the pores, how does that work with? Can the human travel with inter-universe, or does he stay within the same universe?
Okay, good question. My understanding is that it even Lord Brahma
And
was
sorry,
quite...
can the soul travel? Because
Oh, I see. Yeah, but bodies cannot. Bodies cannot. I believe that even Lord Brahmas cannot simply skip from one universe to another, because you have that story where Lord Brahma tried to trick Lord Krishna, And afterwards, Lord Krishna just showed Lord Brahma many other Lord Brahmas offering their praises to Krishna's lotus feet. And these Lord Brahmas had many more heads, and they were responsible for much larger universes than our Brahma. And our Brahma was quite shocked to see all these other universes. So I don't think, unless your name is Narad Muni or you have some special benediction, I don't think in our bodies, or even subtle bodies, we can go from one universe to another. However, the soul is quite different. If let's say, for example, someone passes away, their body passes away, and the soul, of course, lives on, the jiva. And if there's no correct body in this universe to accommodate that person's karma and their desire and what they deserve, there's no planet at all or no species that will accommodate that karma, then in this case they may have to go to another universe. But generally, as far as I understand, most jivas' souls would be somewhere, certainly in this universe.
Okay. So does the Vedic philosophy of this multiverses conform to, how some people think now, that right now, if I'm, for example, Devanshi in this universe, in another universe, there's going to be another Devanshi?
Right. Okay. So again, that's an interesting question. So one of the natural questions is, what is in these other universes? What do we know from the Vedas? There isn't a large amount. What we do know, we know that many other universes are larger than this one. We know that the Lord Brahmas, many of them have more heads, as it were, as has 4. So there may be others with millions of heads, much larger meaning. We know there are different planetary systems and levels, just as there are in this universe. We know there are the elements as well, ego and mind and so on. So that information gives us the impression that there must be some similarities there. There must be, and also we also know, as we were talking about earlier, that mankind is made in God's image. This special special category, if you like, of this human-like form is something which is actually not just, it's coming from God, actually, the form of Lord Krishna and Vishnu and Narayan. So, and that's coming from beyond the whole Tattva, the whole cosmic manifestation. So we can conclude that this human-like form also exists quite prominently in other universes. Another difference is that according to the quantum multiverse theory, most universes will be empty. And this is a very good big point here. According to quantum multiverse, most universes would be unpopulated because in most cases, according to probability, life would not exist. Do you see my point? So you'd have billions and billions and billions of empty universes, and we happen to be in one where there's life. You see what I mean? So it's it's not so exciting, really, quantum multiverse. It just means you're dealing with trillions and trillions of empty universes, and then maybe a tiny percentage would be populated. But actually, it would still be millions of populated universe because of all the different possibilities that exist within that right now. But there would be an innumerable, unimaginable amount of empty, meaningless universes. Whereas in the Vedas, if each universe has a Lord Brahma, that's a living entity. So that means Lord Brahma, we know that not every Lord Brahma is necessarily a pure devotee. We know that sometimes Lord Vishnu himself has to occupy the role of Lord Brahma in some universes. But my understanding is that, therefore, that most universes, if not all, are populated from the Vedic point of view. So it's a case of acknowledging this whole multiverse thing as something which is a similar thread between quantum multiverse and Mahavishnu's thing, but it's actually quite different. It's very, very different kettle of fish altogether. And again, as I mentioned, could it be that the modern understanding of the expansion and contraction of the universe is in any way similar to the breathing of the in and out of the Brahmandalas from his pores of his skin? Because that's almost like an expansion and contraction.
Yeah.
And the answer is, who knows? There are some devotees, great devotees, like Dhanavir Goswami, for example. In fact, to be fair, I've mentioned Sadhguru Prabhu's, but if you look at, say, some of the works of Dhanavir Goswami, This is one of his DVDs about the Vedic cosmos.
Mm.
He focuses entirely on the Vedic point of view, and he's not interested in connecting it to modern perception, because he'd say, well, in the future they may look back at today's theories and think, well, what a load of rubbish that was. You know, do you remember when we believed in the quantum multiverse? Oh, ho, ho. But the Vedic knowledge never changes.
Yeah, modern science is always changing.
It's always changing.
So,
Yeah. So therefore, devotees such as Dhanavika Goswami, but others too, would say, just focus on what the Vedas is telling you, and the modern astronomy, you could say, is almost irrelevant. To who cares? However, that's not the line of Sadhaputta Prabhu in books like this, and it's not the line which I been taking either. What I say is, when there are correlations, when there are parallels, let's have a look at it and see what journey it takes us on, and doing that, acknowledging other non-Vedic things, if you like, for example, Bible, Quran, Eric von Daniken, you know, things like that, other works, let's say, and connecting that with the Vedas to create a bigger overall picture is the path I've taken, and it's enabled me to make all these videos.
yes.
Yeah.
I think thank you so much, Prabhuji. This was really, really enlightening. And as the we need another session, not now, but we will definitely come back to you and request you to be with us again, because it was so meaningful and valuable. So yeah, thank you for your time, and thank you for being with us today. Yeah, please bless us to continue with our work, and so that we can spread yours and many other senior devotees' teachings to the youth.
Well, I'm not qualified to bless you, but I do, as a person-to-person, devotee-to-devotee, encourage you to continue in your good work, and perhaps consider some of the things we've been talking about. But perhaps a lot of the people you talk to will probably be people who just need to chant Hare Krishna and to, you know, make the more practical life transformations. But yes, and I'm not sure how senior I am, but I'm 51 this year, so I guess if that's senior, then fine. I still feel young inside. And thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you so much for coming on with us, Prabhuji. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.